Hi guys. This video is for my sophomore class. Um, I'm going to send you your next reading assignment on Jupiter grades. So check that out. Um, at some point. It will be due next week. All right. So today we're going to talk about politics during the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is the period from 1870 until 1900. So usually when we think of the Gilded Age, we think of we think of business and the rise of industrialization in the United States. That's usually what we mean when we talk about the Gilded Age. But there still was a government, there still were elections, politics was still going on. Excuse me, during this period. But the thing is that politics often took a back seat. In the post-Reconstruction years, politics really wasn't that's better. Politics really wasn't where the action was. The action was in big business and the rise of industry. And often politics was often focused on second-rate issues, like the really big questions really weren't dealt with by major politicians or by either of the political parties. For a variety of reasons we'll talk about later, and often second-rate politicians really were leading the government during this era. There really wasn't any really like big name politician, any like larger than life legendary figure that really was in government really from the time Grant left office up until Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. So this quarter century period in America, like the last quarter of the 19th century, was the political system was basically second rate politicians running for office, leading the government, focused on, in many ways, a second rate political issues. Now, the best men, the people who were really, who were the most educated, the most skilled, most qualified, people tended to go into business instead of government. Because business was kind of where the action was. Like the future was in business. Politics really wasn't where the action was at all. So that's a big reason why a lot of the politicians who led the country during this era really were second rate figures. Because a lot of the best men did not go into politics. So it often attracted some either mediocre people or corrupt people. In fact, that was very often the case in terms of the corruption. Politics was corrupt on every level in this era. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, rural, urban, northern, southern. I remember we said that in our Reconstruction videos, but it got even worse in the last quarter of the 19th century. So second-rate politicians, who are often corrupt, focused on things that, insofar as they were focused on anything at all, were things that really were not what the American public really cared that much about. Now, interestingly, though, despite all these facts that politics was corrupt, that the politicians weren't really any good, and the fact, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in a minute, the fact that there were very few differences between the Democratic and Republican Party on policy, despite all those things, interest in politics was still very, very high. Turnout in elections was higher during this era than at any other point in American history. That seems very strange, right? If politics was really, was really as bad as we just said, why were so many people so passionate that they were willing to actually go vote? I know what you're thinking. Does that involve, or maybe thinking, does just the simple act of voting really involve that much passion? It really does to a degree. You have to get yourself out there and take time out of your day and vote. That's something that 40, 45, 50% of the American public today can't manage to do. So turnout in elections was routinely about 80%. That's extraordinarily high. We've never reached turnout levels anywhere near there. And one of the big reasons is because people turned out, despite the very dull, mediocre nature of politics, was that people were very loyal to their political parties. And the parties were able to excite those loyalties and get people to go out and vote for them. Political parties, I always thought, the way I always think about it during this era is political parties almost were like your favorite sports team. You know, you're really passionate about this team. You root for this team, whether it wins or loses. It's almost part of your identity to support this team. Um, this is the way a lot of people felt about their political parties. I felt very loyal to be a Democrat. I felt very loyal to be a Republican, not because the Democrats stand for X or the Republicans stand for X, but just because that's my team and I'm going to go out and support my team. So this was a very partisan time. I think this analogy hasn't been used as much as I think it should have been, but like now we're living in very partisan times too, and I think in many people are very strongly in the D team or the R team, and I think this harkens back to during the Gilded Age era when people were very loyal to their political parties. The big difference, though, is now often people are loyal to their political parties because there are very real differences on policy between the parties. Back then, there really wasn't. The major issues of the day with big business rising: should big business be regulated? Should wealthy people have to pay more taxes? Should we assist the poor? Should the government assist in getting people to unionize? Those were really the things that were almost screaming out for government action during this era of big business. But neither political party really addressed any of those issues. Parties were generally focused more on the idea of stimulating economic growth rather than regulating business. They generally felt that the job of government is to encourage a good environment for business to thrive. It wasn't to regulate them. It wasn't to regulate hours. It wasn't to regulate wages. It wasn't to help workers or any of that. The focus of government should be on helping business. Now, this basically is what we know as laissez-faire, that the government really should not have a role in laissez-faire, that the government really should not have a role in regulating business. Um, only reason it should keep its hands government should keep its hands off business. The only reason I hesitate at all to actually use the term laissez-faire is because real laissez-faire, means the government should not be involved in business at all. But politicians during this era were generally totally fine with giving business stuff. They gave the railroads free land. They raised tariffs very high to keep out foreign goods. So government often was involved very actively in helping business. So true laissez-faire means it doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't help business. It doesn't regulate business. So this was kind of a more business-friendly version of laissez-faire, right? Keep the government's hands off regulating business, but generally totally fine with the idea of the government helping business. Now, those who wanted more activist government, who said the government, yeah, we should be regulating the railroads, we should be helping the poor, we should be encouraging unionization. Those people were really not that involved in government, particularly on the federal level. In some local areas, like in some of the big cities and in some of the western states, more liberal ideas in terms of regulating business were popular, but it was more on the local level. National politicians really were not focused at all on the idea of regulating business. Corruption again was common on almost every level. Rigged elections, people thrown out votes like, I'm voting for I'm a Democrat, I work for the political machine. Here's a Republican vote, I toss the Republican vote. You toss enough votes to make sure that you win elections, but not all of them, because then it would be obvious. Multiple voting, people used to go out and just vote like a lot. So there was a lot of corruption in politics. That's how passionate people were about helping their team, about making sure their team / political party won. They were willing to resort to all measure of corruption. Now let's talk a little bit about who was a Democrat and who was a Republican during this era. Again, there were very few policy differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. The one big policy difference, in fact, the only real policy difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, was the issue of the tariff. Republicans, remember, following Hamilton, Clay, free soil ideas generally favored a high tariff because it's a protective tariff. It keeps foreign goods away. It protects American industry from foreign competition. Democrats generally favored a low tariff because a low tariff means that people have a greater choice of goods, right? And whether I want to buy foreign goods or American goods. And because of that competition, that generally meant prices were lower. So that's why Democrats favored low tariffs. So that was really the only difference that existed between the political parties during this era, the issue of the tariff. Okay, so if you were a Democrat, most people not all, there are always exceptions, but most people who were Democrats during this era were either Southerners or from the northern cities. So the Democratic Party was this very strange coalition in many ways of the Jim Crow South and big cities, which often were populated by immigrants. So the Democratic Party, often seemed very disorganized and scattered, and that was a big reason because it was a coalition of people who, you would think have no business being in the same party with each other. But a lot of this was based on historical ties, right? The Democratic Party was the party that had resisted attempts to limit slavery, had opposed the Civil War, had opposed Reconstruction. So that's why the Southerners are Democrats. And people in the big cities, a lot of immigrants, especially the Irish, were Democrats because the Democrats generally had a much more laissez-faire view on cultural issues. Like what I mean by cultural issues is just like lifestyle issues. Like I don't mean economic stuff, regulating business or anything like that. Like Democrats generally were less concerned about, whether you went to church, for instance, or what church you went to. They generally were less concerned with drinking. The Democrats really weren't crazy about all the temperance ideas that the government should stop people from drinking. And that often attracted a lot of immigrants because a lot of immigrants came from countries where the government constantly told them how to live. So that laissez-faire message on lifestyle cultural issues made the Democratic Party very appealing to a lot of northern immigrants. So we had the South and we had immigrants. And we also remember immigrants had been Democrats since the Jackson era, right? The northern cities were very, very friendly to Jackson's ideas. And a lot of those loyalties stuck. Now, when you add the groups together who supported the Democratic Party, that generally was about 48% of the American public. That's a lot of people, right? But it also, in a two-party system, makes it very difficult to win a national election, which is why Democrats had a very hard time winning national elections. There were only two Democratic presidents from the period of from 1860 until 1932. That's a 72-year period. Only two Democrats were elected president, largely because that Democratic coalition we talked about. It was very hard, sometimes impossible really, to get to 50. Sometimes that last 3 or 4% is some of the hardest in politics, right? Even today, each party could pretty much count on Biden and Trump. I bet you will each get at least 46% of the vote. Well, at least 8. But like that, 3 to 8% of the American public, it's very hard to get from 46 to 50. And in the Democrats' case, it was very hard to get to, in fact, never, even when the Democrats did win with those two presidents, Cleveland and Wilson, they never got to 50. So it's very hard to get, across the finish line for the Democratic Party. So the Republican Party was the dominant party in American politics during this era because their coalition was bigger. People who were Republicans back then, small town America, very Republican. Rural America, very Republican. If you were a veteran of the Civil War, you were probably a Republican because the Republicans were identified with the Union cause, Lincoln, Grant, Reconstruction, all of that. One of the biggest groups, political interest groups during this era was a group called the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR. The Grand Army of the Republic was a group of Union Army veterans. And this group was very influential politically and very influential in Republican Party politics. And many times they pulled the strings in the Republican Party. Remember, we talked about waving the bloody shirt with Republicans attempting to remind voters that the Democrats were the party of the South, the party of treason. So Republicans routinely waved the bloody shirt in political elections, and it worked. Because people in many ways were still, I mentioned this before, but this is very important. people were still basically voting their Civil War loyalties decades after the Civil War was over. And those loyalties were stuck for decades. This is how one Republican described the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party may best be described as a common sewer and a loathsome receptacle into which is emptied every element of the South and the treasonous North. So that shows you how the Civil War loyalties still are very, very strong. Republicans generally advocated Civil War pensions for veterans. They routinely nominated generals or Union Army vets for political office. So the Civil War was still foremost in the mind of a lot of people back then, a lot of Republicans. Religion, family tradition, and ethnic ties tended to lead you to either the Republican or the Democratic Party. So people who are Catholic, and remember the Catholic population is increasing during this time because of all the immigration. If you were a Catholic, you are almost definitely a Democrat. Because again, the Democrats were seen as a lot more loose on religion. The Republicans were the party of old stock Protestants. So if you were a Catholic, you were probably a Democrat. Your family, what your family was, often determined your political party. Family ties. Think in many ways it was like religion. Like if somebody is Jewish or Methodist or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever you are, the thing is that often, even if you don't necessarily believe in what the religion believes, you still identify as whatever religion your family is. That's true for most people. And that was true about the political parties. I came from a Democratic family. I came from a Republican family. So that means I'm a Democrat. That means I'm a Republican. Yeah. Old stock wasps. Remember, we use that term wasp, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's someone who's of English, Scottish descent, Scotch-Irish descent, the majority of the country, certainly back then. Old stock wasps generally were Republicans. People of British descent, people who were Scandinavian descent, were generally Republicans. Because again, the Republican Party was the small town America of Northern America Protestants. In many ways. Black people who still could vote, black people could still vote in the North, even though they were losing their right to vote in the South. Black people were overwhelmingly Republican. Because Republican, that was the party of Lincoln. That was the party that freed the slaves. That was the party that supported Reconstruction. So again, Civil War loyalties determining the way a group votes. So the Democratic Party, even though that's Republicans, the Democratic Party, even though it was dominated by Southern racists, that's the core of the Democratic Party, generally were more tolerant of religious differences. So the Republican Party was definitely the party of Protestants. But the Democratic Party, it was too, but the Democrats generally were okay, or at least tolerated Catholicism. Which is again another thing that kind of led a lot of people who were Catholic to the Democratic Party. The alcohol issue, temperance was often very, very much a part of politics during this era. And the thing is that Republicans tended to be a lot more supportive of the idea of limiting alcohol than the Democrats were. But the temperance issue kind of raised its head quite a bit, in American politics during this era. And the thing is that your ethnic and religious ties often influenced which party you supported, which often influenced the way each party felt about prohibition. Now, this was also the era of machine politics. Now, a political machine, I think I gave you the definition in class way back when. A political machine is a large political operation that runs a major city. And when you say machine politics, you're generally implying corruption, because a lot of these political machines were very, very corrupt. The man who was in charge, and it was always a man, who was in charge of the political machines was known as the boss. Sometimes I get some smart aleck in class who says that, well, of course, it's the boss, he's the one in charge. But it has a lot more, it means a lot more in a political context. A boss is someone who controls the machine and basically controls the city. Control whatever city you're talking about. Most political machines were democratic. Because remember, most big cities, most people who were urban were Democratic, except for Philadelphia, interestingly, which had a Republican political machine. And political machines ran most of the major cities in the United States. Usually, they were dominated by Irish politicians, because remember, Irish people tended to get very involved in politics. Of course, the famous political machine in New York City that controlled New York City politics is Tammany Hall. And they controlled everything. So they collect taxes. They issued licenses. So if you wanted a city license, you needed a city license for a lot of stuff. You had to get Tammany Hall to give it to you. And they remembered who their friends were and who their enemies were, and they rewarded or punished accordingly. So if you really wanted to really function or do any business at all in the city, you kind of had to be on the right side of the political machine or pay off the political machine. Which is really, really bad. And political machines often worked hand in glove with big corporations. There was often this symbiotic relationship between big business and the political machines. So we give big business, we give you money, either contributions or bribes, in exchange for the issuing of licenses and friendly treatment by city government. So one thing that should be asked is, why did people tolerate this? Why did people in the cities generally support the political machines? Some were just accepted things because that's just the way some people always are. They just accept whatever. But another reason is because the political machines often help poor people in the cities. And the thing is, there were a lot of poor people in the cities. And remember, this is before there were any social programs, right? There was no welfare, there was no unemployment, there was no health insurance from the government. There was nothing. So often the only people helping you at all when you were experiencing a life of poverty in these cities were the political machines. And a man named George Washington Plunkett, who is a major figure in Tammany Hall, once I wrote a paper about him in college. I know that's my line. But I did. Plunkett actually said, the poor are the most grateful people in the world. That if you help a poor person, they'll always remember that you helped them. That's pretty much true, right? If someone never helped you, if you're a person no one ever helped, the person who finally does help you, you're very grateful. So, if this is if a poor person was helped, then how will you help? Sometimes they help pay your fine. If you got arrested for something like low level, they kind of helped you get out of jail, help relatives, your children, your nieces and nephews get out of jail. They gave away a tremendous amount of jobs to people, at a time when jobs were often very hard to come by, at least good paying jobs. So they earned the loyalty of city residents by actually doing some things for city residents at a time when nobody really was doing anything to help poor people. So they were often the only social program around. So they're helping you. They give you a turkey for Thanksgiving or for Christmas. They let you help get your nephew out of jail if he was arrested for being drunk in the street. You're going to vote for them. You'll overlook the fact that they're shady. So the political machines just kind of relied on that model, and the corruption was just beyond belief. In these big cities, and often providing very poor social services, right? The sewer contract, the construction contract, who built the schools, who built the roads, often were determined by who paid bribes to the political machines. It wasn't determined by who would do the best job. The people who got government jobs were people who were just connected with the political machine rather than competent people necessarily. So the thing is that by the end of the 19th century, there was a new group of people called urban reformers who said that we have to change machine politics, that it just is not serving the public anymore. And that was a really big cause for the progressive movement in the early 20th century, reforming the political machines. All right, guys, very good. So remember, I want you to watch all these videos, and I want you to watch them from start to finish. In our next video, we're gonna again check Jupiter grades. I'll be sending you your next reading assignment. And in our next video, we're gonna continue talking about politics and how everything we talked about translated into federal elections in the late 1870s, 1880s. All right, hope you're all doing well in quarantine, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.